The Galactic Council's headquarters was a monolithic space station drifting serenely between two suns. Inside, chaos reigned. Representatives from dozens of alien species floated in their designated pods, chittering in their native tongues, projecting grievances, or silently stewing in frustration. Two of the most ancient and powerful empires, the Zorthil and the Talanex, were on the verge of igniting a war that could tear half the galaxy apart, and the Council was failing to stop it. For the last time, the insult was intentional, hissed General Throne of the Talanex Empire, his reptilian scales shimmering with indignation. The Zorthil dishonored us by violating the sanctity of our border systems. There can be no peace without restitution. The Zorthil ambassador, Keltis, floated serenely in his shimmering robes, his tentacle-like appendages coiling thoughtfully. His species viewed emotions as primitive distractions. Your accusations are without logic, your border systems were uninhabited, and your ritualistic interpretations are irrelevant to strategic concerns. This is not an insult, it is an operational fact. General Throne hissed violently. Call it operational one more time and I'll show you operational. The council chamber descended into cacophony as the representatives argued. The Talanex, hot-blooded and ritual-bound, found the Zorthil's cold, analytical approach insufferable. Meanwhile, the Zorthil dismissed the Talanex as irrational and incapable of reason. The tensions had simmered for centuries, but now, one incident too many had sent both empires spiraling toward the brink of war. The Council's High Arbiter, a towering insectoid alien, raised a mandible in frustration. "Enough," he declared, mandibles clicking in irritation. "If this continues, both empires will be sanctioned. You will reach an agreement or face expulsion from Council trade routes." "An agreement is impossible," Keltis said flatly. "The Talanex cling to meaningless customs, and the Zorthil disrespect everything sacred," General Throne growled. The High Arbiter emitted a frustrated hum. The situation was hopeless. Neither side would back down, and the Council's attempts to mediate had only made things worse. The Cold War between the two empires was on the verge of going hot, and no one knew how to stop it. No one except perhaps the last option the Council had left: humanity. In a quiet corner of the station, James Halliday sipped a cup of synthetic coffee, staring blankly at his mission brief. His ship had arrived a few hours ago, summoned by an urgent request from the Council. Now he sat alone in a waiting room, trying to figure out how the hell he had ended up here. A hologram flickered in front of him, displaying the vital statistics of the Zorthil and the Talanex empires. Both were ancient civilizations that had been trading insults, and occasionally missiles, for millennia. Negotiating between them was like trying to settle a feud between a volcano and an iceberg. They were fundamentally incompatible, and yet, somehow, the Council had decided to call in a human to solve it. Halliday groaned, rubbing his temples. "They want me to fix this? Great. I'll just explain to them that they're both being irrational. That should go well." His datapad beeped, reminding him that his presence was required in the negotiation chamber. He drained the last of his coffee, straightened his rumpled jacket, and gave himself a half-hearted pep talk. "All right, James, just do what humans do best. Improvise." When Halliday entered the chamber, every alien eye locked onto him. The Zorthil delegation looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain. To them, humans were a strange, immature species with an unfortunate tendency to rely on intuition rather than logic. The Talanex general, by contrast, stared at him with open hostility, as if offended by his mere existence. Halliday guessed the Talanex weren't big on casual Friday attire. "So," Halliday began, clapping his hands together, "what seems to be the problem?" There was a long, awkward silence. The Zorthil ambassador's tentacles twitched. "The problem," he said coolly, "is that the Talanex have once again misinterpreted a strategic maneuver as a personal insult." "It was an insult," General Throne barked, slamming his fist on the table. "The Zorthil dishonored us by crossing into our sacred territories." "I see," Halliday said, nodding thoughtfully. "So you're mad because they trespassed, and you're mad because their trespassing is logically sound but emotionally stupid?" "That is an oversimplification," Keltis said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Good," Halliday replied, flashing a grin. "I love oversimplifying things. It's kind of our thing." The Zorthil ambassador narrowed his eyes. "This is not a matter for humor. On the contrary," Halliday said, leaning casually against the conference table. "I think humor is exactly what this situation needs." Both delegations stared at him, baffled. "Look, I get it," Halliday continued. You've both got ancient histories, complicated customs, and a whole lot of pride. But here's the thing. Nobody wins a Cold War. You either make peace or you blow each other to pieces, and frankly, the latter option sounds exhausting. General Throne bristled. We do not fear exhaustion. Halliday gave him a sympathetic smile. Of course not, but wouldn't it be nice to take a break from hating each other for a little while? I mean, humans have been doing it for years. Works like a charm. The Zorthil ambassador tilted his head. And how exactly have you managed this? Halliday shrugged. Simple. We throw parties. There was a stunned silence. Parties? Keltis repeated as if the word were a foreign concept. Yep, Halliday said, smiling. When things get tense, we gather a bunch of people together, eat too much food, play ridiculous games, and maybe throw in a little karaoke. It's a great way to remember that life's too short to be angry all the time. General Throne's scales bristled. This is absurd. Absolutely. Halliday agreed cheerfully, and that's why it works. He reached into his bag and pulled out a deck of cards. Look, why don't we start small? Ever heard of a game called poker? It's a great way to pass the time, build trust, and, most importantly, learn that bluffing is a lot harder than it looks. The alien delegations exchanged bewildered glances. This was unlike any diplomatic strategy they had ever encountered. For centuries, their negotiations had been conducted with rigid formality and carefully chosen words. And now, a human was offering them playing cards and talking about parties. But the thing about humans, Halliday knew, is that they thrived in chaos. They found solutions in the strangest places. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was bringing people together, even when those people wanted to kill each other. Well, Halliday asked, shuffling the deck with practiced ease, are you in? Or are you scared? General Throne's eyes narrowed, his pride stung. The Taloneks fear nothing. Great, Halliday said, dealing the first hand. Let's play. And so, to the amazement of everyone in the council chamber, the ancient Cold War between two mighty empires began to unravel, not through threats or treaties, but over a friendly game of cards. Halliday grinned to himself as he watched the two sides fumble through the rules, their centuries-old grudges momentarily forgotten. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and sometimes all it takes to change the galaxy is a little bit of chaos. The air in the negotiation chamber was thick with tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension James Halliday was unfamiliar with. He'd walked into boardrooms with more hostility, and definitely worse coffee. Still, this was going to be a whole new challenge. He was, after all, sitting between two empires whose grudges stretched back millennia. The Zorthil ambassador, Keltis, and the Taloneks general, Throne, sat at opposite ends of the table, glaring at each other. Neither side seemed ready to make the first move, and both regarded Halliday with a mix of confusion and disdain, as if they couldn't quite decide whether he was an ambassador, a comedian, or just an idiot. Halliday leaned back in his chair, pretending not to notice the hostile stares. So, he said, hands steepled, let's break the ice. General Throne, Ambassador Keltis, if either of you were human, I'd suggest we grab some coffee and hash this out like adults. But since I'm guessing coffee isn't universal, he produced 2 small cups from his bag, filled with Earth's finest instant brew. Care to give it a try? No better way to start a negotiation. Keltis recoiled as if Halliday had offered him a live grenade. We do not indulge in chemical stimulants. Throne leaned forward, sniffing the air with curiosity. What is this? A warrior's drink? You bet, Halliday said, sliding the cup toward the Taloneks general. Fuel's half the important decisions humans make. The other half are fueled by sheer panic. The general snorted, the closest thing to a laugh Halliday had heard from him. He lifted the cup, gave it a tentative sip, and immediately coughed, his scales flushing a shade darker. This is potent, Keltis watched with disapproval, his appendages twitching in distaste. I fail to see how this frivolity advances the negotiations. It doesn't, Halliday said cheerfully. That's the point. You've been negotiating the same way for centuries, and where has that gotten you? He leaned forward, grinning. Humor me. Let's try something different. Both aliens regarded him with a mix of wariness and disbelief. Negotiation in their minds was a sacred process, a dance of honor and logic. Halliday's casual approach felt like heresy, but curiosity, more than anything, held them in place. You know, Halliday continued, you two remind me of my cousins back home. They've been fighting since they were kids, always over the dumbest things, like who stole whose pudding in 1997. Couldn't agree on the truth if their lives depended on it. Keltis blinked slowly. Pudding? It's not important, Halliday said with a wave. What's important is that after years of fighting, you know what finally brought them together? Game night. got them laughing, competing, and before long they forgot what they were mad about in the first place. Are you suggesting we play games? Throne's voice dripped with disbelief. Exactly, Halliday said, tapping the table. Think of it as a way to reset. A fresh start, no stakes, just a little fun. Ever heard of charades? Both aliens looked at him like he'd lost his mind. It's simple, Halliday explained, undeterred. One person acts something out without talking and the others have to guess what it is. It's a great way to learn how the other side thinks. Builds trust, and sometimes, he added with a grin, makes you look ridiculous. Which is good, by the way. Nothing builds bridges faster than shared embarrassment. Throne scowled. We are not children. Good, Halliday shot back, because children are way better at charades. For a moment, it seemed the meeting would collapse into failure right then and there. Throne looked ready to walk out, and Keltis appeared to be calculating how long it would take to have Halliday escorted off the station. But then, something surprising happened. Throne cracked a small reptilian grin. This is absurd, the general muttered, shaking his head. But I am curious. What do we have to lose? Keltis sighed, clearly exasperated, but inclined to stay if only to observe the humans' strange ritual. Very well, he said with thinly veiled contempt. Let us witness this game night. An hour later, Halliday found himself standing in the middle of the conference room, flapping his arms like a bird while the two most powerful aliens in the sector tried, and failed, to guess what he was doing. Some kind of predatory beast? Throne guessed, leaning forward in his chair. Keltis, frowning, added, or an injured drone. Halliday threw his hands in the air. Come on, guys, a chicken, it's a chicken. The two aliens exchanged blank stares. What is a chicken? Keltis asked. Halliday groaned, slumping back into his chair. Okay, so maybe charades wasn't the best choice. Despite the awkward start, the ice was starting to crack. For the first time since they'd entered the room, the two alien representatives weren't glaring daggers at each other. There were even hints of amusement in their voices, though they'd probably never admit it. Encouraged, Halliday pulled out another game. Pictionary. All right, this one's easier. You draw something and the other team has to guess what it is. Throne accepted the marker with an expression that suggested he was preparing for battle. Keltis, on the other hand, observed with clinical curiosity, as if trying to determine what ancient Earth wisdom could possibly be gleaned from this bizarre ritual. Throne drew an elaborate series of jagged lines and spirals that looked suspiciously like a tactical map. Halliday squinted at it. A star system? A military formation? Keltis leaned closer, his tentacles curling in thought. It appears to depict a concept, something symbolic. It's a tree, Throne said flatly. Halliday chuckled. You guys are really overthinking this. Keltis's expression shifted, the faintest glimmer of realization dawning in his alien mind. Perhaps that is the problem. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Halliday leaned back, sensing an opportunity. See? That's what game night's all about. Getting out of your own heads for a bit. You've both been stuck in this cycle for so long, you can't even see the simple stuff anymore. Throne's reptilian eyes narrowed. And you believe this game night will solve centuries of conflict? Halliday shrugged. Hey, it worked for my cousins. Keltis tilted his head, his tentacles twitching thoughtfully. I must admit, this approach is unlike any we have encountered before. That's humanity for you, Halliday said with a grin. We don't make sense, but we get results. By the end of the session, something remarkable had happened. The Zorthil and Talonex representatives were no longer enemies. They were competitors, locked in friendly rivalry over a game neither of them fully understood. Laughter, awkward though it was, echoed through the chamber. As they wrapped up the impromptu game night, Halliday saw the change he'd been hoping for, the beginnings of mutual respect. For the first time in centuries, the two sides weren't glaring at each other across a battlefield. They were, in a strange way, bonding. Well, Halliday said, gathering up the game pieces, that was productive. Same time next week? Throne gave a huff that might have been a laugh. You are peculiar, human, but I admit this was not unpleasant. Keltis inclined his head slightly. Perhaps there is some merit to your methods. Halliday grinned. That's the spirit. Now we're getting somewhere. As the two alien representatives left the room, exchanging tentative but genuine nods of respect, Halliday leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and with humans, a start was all they needed. The awkward truce born from game night was unexpected but promising. James Halliday wasn't deluded enough to believe that a single round of charades would untangle centuries of hatred, but it had done something crucial. It cracked the rigid ancient walls these two empires had built around themselves, and for the first time, he sensed they were curious about him, about each other, and about what could happen next. Seizing the momentum, Halliday organized a second meeting, this time with a different approach. More games, more friendly competition, and, because he believed no diplomacy could succeed without food, a buffet of human-inspired snacks. As the Zorthil and Talanex delegations entered the neutral conference room, their expressions were guarded but less hostile than before. Keltis drifted in with his usual unflappable calm, while General Throne stomped in like he was ready to wrestle a black hole. "I see you've brought sustenance," Keltis remarked, eyeing the array of snacks. "Yep," Halliday said cheerfully. "Welcome to diplomacy human style. Take a load off, grab a snack, and let's dive right in. I recommend the nachos. They're scientifically proven to solve at least 50% of Earth's problems." Keltis gave him a blank stare as usual, but Throne leaned over the table, sniffing the air suspiciously. "What is this?" "Nachos," Halliday repeated, holding up a chip loaded with melted cheese. "Delicious, crunchy, and covered in gooey goodness." Throne cautiously picked up a nacho and took a bite. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked genuinely impressed. "This pleases me." "Good to hear," Halliday grinned. "See? Progress already." Keltis predictably abstained from the nachos, choosing instead to observe the proceedings with quiet detachment, but the tension in the room was noticeably lighter than before. The ice was slowly melting, and that was all Halliday needed to push things further. "All right, folks," he said, clapping his hands together. "Today's agenda, friendly competition and cultural exchange. We've got some new games to play, and I'm calling this one Pictionary. Throne tilted his head. "Another human game? You bet," Halliday said, handing out markers and tablets. "One of you draws, the others guess. Simple, fun. And it helps you understand each other in ways words can't." Keltis eyed the marker in his tentacle-like appendage, as if it were a dangerous weapon. "Drawing is inefficient." "Not everything has to be efficient, my friend," Halliday replied. "Sometimes it's just about having fun." The first few rounds of Pictionary were rough, to say the least. Throne approached the game like a battlefield exercise, drawing with the precision of a military cartographer. His lines were sharp, deliberate, and entirely incomprehensible to anyone but himself. "It's clearly a tactical formation," Throne said, frustrated, after Keltis failed to guess his drawing for the third time in a row. "It looks more like debris," Keltis offered, his voice cool but not unkind. Halliday tried not to laugh. "See? This is what cultural exchange is all about, learning to see things from a different perspective." Next, Keltis attempted a drawing. His approach was the exact opposite of Throne's. Abstract, elegant, and utterly baffling. Halliday squinted at the swirling lines on the tablet. A solar flare? No. Wait. A nebula? It's peace," Keltis said with a hint of frustration. Halliday leaned back, grinning. "Ah, abstract art. I like it." Throne gave a dismissive snort. "Peace is not a shape." "Exactly," Halliday said. "And that's the beauty of it." Despite the chaotic nature of the game, something remarkable began to happen. The Zorthil and Talanex representatives, though still fundamentally different in their worldviews, started to find moments of understanding, a shared laugh here, a mutual groan there. For the first time in centuries, they weren't just adversaries locked in a bitter rivalry. They were people playing a game together. It was a small, strange kind of magic, but it worked. After an hour of games, Halliday called for a break. The Zorthil and Talanex delegates gathered around the snack table, tentatively engaging in small talk, though it was more awkward than amicable. Keltis commented on the inefficiency of human diplomacy, while Throne grumbled about the lack of honor in games. But even their complaints were softer than before, more curious than confrontational. Halliday stood off to the side, watching with quiet satisfaction. The progress was slow, but it was there. Inch by inch, the ancient animosities were giving way to something new. "Elise would never believe this," he muttered to himself, thinking of his fellow diplomats back on Earth. "I should have brought a camera." As the break ended, Halliday introduced the final game of the day, Monopoly. "This one's a classic," he explained, setting up the board. "It's all about money, strategy, and ruining friendships." Throne frowned. "That sounds dishonorable." "Trust me," Halliday said with a grin. "It's educational." The game began with cautious moves, each side testing the waters. Throne, unsurprisingly, played aggressively, buying up properties like a warlord conquering territories. Keltis, on the other hand, approached the game with calculated precision, refusing to make any move unless it was perfectly optimized. "This property offers minimal returns," Keltis muttered, analyzing his options. "That's not the point," Throne growled. "The point is to control as much as possible. You see? Halliday said, sitting back with a satisfied grin. You guys are already getting the hang of it. Despite their wildly different strategies, both sides became increasingly invested in the game. They argued, strategized, and, inevitably, accused each other of cheating. This rent is outrageous, Keltis protested as Throne demanded an exorbitant payment. It's not cheating, Throne said smugly. It's strategy. By the time the game ended, both sides were thoroughly exhausted but strangely content. For the first time in centuries, the Zorthil and Talanex representatives had engaged in something other than posturing and threats. They had played, laughed, and, most importantly, talked. As they packed up the game, Keltis turned to Halliday with a thoughtful expression. I must admit, human, your methods are unconventional. Unconventional is what we do best, Halliday replied with a wink. And it seems to be working. Throne gave a reluctant nod. This was not unpleasant. High praise, Halliday said with a grin. I'll take it. As the Zorthil and Talanex delegations prepared to leave, Halliday felt a flicker of hope. They weren't friends, at least not yet, but they were no longer enemies locked in a cold war. They had taken the first steps toward understanding, however small and clumsy those steps might be. And in diplomacy, a small step was often the hardest to take. Same time next week? Halliday called after them as they left the room. Keltis paused at the doorway, his tentacles curling thoughtfully. Perhaps. Throne gave a grunt of agreement, which Halliday took as a resounding yes. As the doors closed behind them, Halliday let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And for humans, progress was everything. With a satisfied smile, Halliday packed up the game board, already planning the next session. He had no idea how far this strange experiment in diplomacy would go. But one thing was certain, he wasn't done playing yet. The next time Halliday called for a meeting, he added something new to the mix: cultural exchange. After 2 successful sessions of game night, the Zorthil and Talanex had loosened up just enough to tolerate, if not quite enjoy, each other's company. It was progress, but Halliday knew they needed more than just games to bridge the gap between them. They needed to understand each other on a deeper level. That's where the idea of cultural exchange came in. When the Zorthil and Talanex delegations arrived at the meeting room, Halliday greeted them with his usual easygoing grin. Welcome, folks. Today's agenda, a little give and take. We're going to learn about each other's traditions, customs, and, most importantly, how you see the world. He clapped his hands. Because, believe it or not, understanding where someone's coming from makes it a lot harder to blow them up. The Zorthil ambassador, Keltis, arched a delicate appendage in mild skepticism. This seems unnecessary. Yeah, that's what they said about seatbelts too, Halliday replied. But here we are. Throne, the Talanex general, crossed his arms. If we are to participate in this exchange, then we must start with something worthy. The dance of ancestral honor is one of the most revered traditions in Talanex culture. It symbolizes our connection to the warriors who came before us. Perfect, Halliday said, gesturing grandly. Let's see it. Throne's expression turned solemn as he stepped to the center of the room. He removed the ceremonial weapon strapped to his side and placed it on the floor with reverence. Then, to Halliday's amazement, the massive scaled warrior began to move with surprising grace, his heavy frame twisting and spinning in deliberate, intricate patterns. It was a mesmerizing performance, a dance that spoke of pride, loss, and fierce loyalty to his ancestors. When Throne finished, the room was silent for a moment. Even Keltis seemed impressed, his tentacles curling in what Halliday interpreted as cautious admiration. That, Halliday said, genuinely moved, was incredible. Seriously, 10 out of 10. Would dance again. Throne gave a small, satisfied nod. The dance of ancestral honor is a reflection of our deepest values. And it shows, Halliday replied. Now it's your turn, Keltis. What's one of the Zorthil's most cherished traditions? Keltis hesitated for a moment, clearly unenthused about participating in what he undoubtedly viewed as a pointless exercise. But after a brief internal debate, he relented. The Zorthil prize logic above all else. One of our most respected pastimes is the solving of infinite patterns, a puzzle with no definitive solution. Halliday blinked. A puzzle with no solution. That sounds frustrating. It is a meditation on the nature of existence, Keltis explained. The process of attempting to solve it is more important than the outcome. Sounds like college algebra, Halliday muttered under his breath. All right. Let's give it a try. Keltis produced a small crystalline object from his robes, a shimmering geometric puzzle that seemed to shift and change with every movement. As he placed it on the table, the Talanex delegation stared at it with thinly veiled confusion. Throne leaned closer, frowning. "What is the objective?" "There is no objective," Keltis replied serenely. "Only the pursuit." The Talon-X general gave an exasperated grunt. "That is pointless." Halliday chuckled. "Exactly. That's the beauty of it." Over the next hour, the two delegations took turns engaging with each other's traditions. The Talon-X struggled valiantly with the infinite pattern puzzle, growing increasingly frustrated as the puzzle seemed to evolve just beyond their understanding. Meanwhile, the Zorthil did their best to mimic the dance of ancestral honor, though their stiff, precise movements lacked the fluidity and passion of the original. What began as awkward fumbling soon gave way to moments of unexpected humor. The sight of Keltis attempting to perform a Talon-X dance move, his tentacles flailing wildly, elicited a rumbling chuckle from Throne. And when the Talon-X warriors threw their hands up in frustration after failing to solve the Zorthil puzzle, even Keltis allowed himself a faint, amused smile. "See," Halliday said, beaming. "Look at you two. Practically best friends. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, human." Throne grumbled, though there was no malice in his voice. Keltis inclined his head slightly. "Your methods are unconventional, but perhaps not without merit." Halliday took that as the highest compliment he was likely to get. "I'll take it." After the cultural exchange wrapped up, Halliday suggested they sit down for dinner, a buffet of dishes inspired by both human and alien cuisines. There was a little bit of everything: Earth-style pizza, Talon-X spiced meats, and a Zorthil nutrient broth that smelled suspiciously like motor oil. Halliday piled his plate high and dug in with enthusiasm, setting the tone for the meal. As they ate, the conversation flowed more freely than it had before. They discussed the peculiarities of each other's customs, shared stories from their respective histories, and, slowly but surely, began to see each other not as enemies, but as people with their own struggles, triumphs, and quirks. Halliday seized the opportunity to introduce the concept of compromise. "Back on Earth," he said, gesturing with a slice of pizza, "we've got this thing called splitting the pizza. It's what we do when there's only one pizza but everybody wants different toppings." Throne frowned. "And how does this splitting work?" "Well," Halliday said, "you don't try to force everyone to eat the same thing. Instead, you divide it up so each person gets a piece they like. Nobody gets exactly what they want, but everybody gets something, and that's the whole point of compromise. Finding a way to coexist without anyone getting blown up." Keltis considered this for a moment, his tentacles curling thoughtfully. Practical concept." Throne nodded slowly, his expression unusually contemplative. "There is wisdom in this. Pizza." Halliday grinned. "Glad you think so. Now, if we can figure out how to split the galaxy the way we split a pizza, we might just be onto something." By the end of the evening, something remarkable had happened. The walls between the Zorthil and Talon-X delegations, once so impenetrable, had begun to crumble. They weren't friends, not yet, but they were no longer enemies locked in a cold war either. They were two ancient civilizations, learning, tentatively, awkwardly, but earnestly, how to meet each other halfway. As the meeting drew to a close, Keltis and Throne exchanged a nod of mutual respect. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Halliday watched them go, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Progress was slow, messy, and unpredictable, but it was progress, and that was all he needed. As the doors closed behind the two delegations, Halliday leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, and let out a contented sigh. "You know," he muttered to himself, "if I pull this off, I'm putting galactic pizza diplomacy on my resume." The next, and potentially final session loomed large over James Halliday. The slow, awkward progress between the Zorthil and Talon-X delegations had been encouraging, but it was clear that centuries of mistrust wouldn't dissolve easily. They were teetering between breakthrough and collapse, and Halliday knew that if today's negotiations failed, the two ancient empires would plunge headfirst into war. He stood in the empty conference room, running a hand through his hair. A table of snacks sat waiting, alongside a board game they hadn't tried yet, Risk. He'd saved it for this last-ditch effort, a game about world domination that would either backfire spectacularly or become the final step toward peace. "Okay, James," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his jacket. "One more round. Time to bring the chaos." The doors hissed open as the delegations filed in. General Throne strode in first, his reptilian armor gleaming under the fluorescent lights, followed by Keltis, gliding with his usual air of cold calculation. Both paused, exchanging wary glances. Whatever tentative goodwill they'd built was still fragile. Halliday forced a smile and gestured toward the game board. "All right, folks, Today we're going all in. This game is called Risk, and the goal is simple: conquer the world. Keltis arched a tentacle in skepticism. This seems counterproductive. Exactly, Halliday said with a grin. That's the beauty of it. It's a game where everyone thinks they're in control until everything falls apart. Throne gave a low growl. A warrior's game, then. Sort of, Halliday replied, sitting down and beginning to set up the pieces. But there's a twist. You'll learn that sometimes, no matter how well you plan, you still lose. And sometimes, the only way to win is by making peace. The game started off predictably enough. Throne played aggressively, storming across the board and claiming territories with brute force, while Keltis took a more calculated approach, securing key positions and biding his time. The early turns were tense, with both sides locking horns and refusing to back down. Halliday could feel the weight of centuries-old resentment simmering just beneath the surface. And then, just as he'd hoped, chaos struck. A series of bad dice rolls left Throne's armies decimated, his once mighty empire reduced to a scattering of isolated strongholds. Keltis, seeing an opportunity, pressed the advantage, sweeping across the board with ruthless precision. For a moment, it seemed as though the game and the fragile peace was about to shatter under the weight of old grudges, but then something unexpected happened. Throne laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a forced smile. It was a deep, rumbling laugh, full of amusement and self-awareness, as if he'd just realized how ridiculous the whole thing was. Your strategy is commendable, Zorthil, he said, still grinning, but luck is a treacherous ally. Keltis blinked, clearly caught off guard by the Talanex general's sudden change in demeanor. For a moment, the cold, calculating ambassador seemed genuinely uncertain of how to respond. And then, hesitantly, awkwardly, he smiled. Indeed, Keltis said quietly. Luck is irrational. Halliday leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching with quiet satisfaction as the two ancient enemies shared a rare moment of mutual understanding. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the role of chance in their centuries-long conflict, the first crack in the unyielding armor of certainty that had kept them at odds for so long. You see, Halliday said, smiling, sometimes things don't go the way you plan, and that's okay. The trick isn't to fight it. It's to adapt. Throne gave a thoughtful nod. Adaptation is a strength. Keltis inclined his head, a rare insight from a Talanex. Throne grinned, baring sharp teeth. Careful, Zorthil. You're starting to sound almost complimentary. With the tension eased, the game shifted from competition to collaboration. Instead of trying to destroy each other, the two sides began working together, forging temporary alliances and negotiating truces. They debated strategy, shared ideas, and even, occasionally, joked. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. By the time the game ended, the board was a chaotic mess of territories, alliances, and betrayals, just like real life, Halliday thought with amusement. But unlike real life, the game ended in laughter instead of bloodshed. That, Throne said, setting down his final piece, was enlightening. Keltis nodded in agreement. It seems there is value in unpredictability. Halliday grinned. Welcome to the human experience. With the ice well and truly broken, Halliday shifted the conversation toward more serious matters. Over the next hour, they began drafting a preliminary peace agreement, a document that, while far from perfect, represented a genuine step toward reconciliation. It was a fragile truce, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and a newfound understanding that even the most ancient empires could learn from one another. As they worked through the details, old habits resurfaced. Keltis nitpicked every clause, while Throne insisted on including several elaborate oaths of honor. But instead of driving them apart, the negotiations became an exercise in compromise. Keltis conceded certain points for the sake of efficiency, and Throne, to everyone's surprise, agreed to omit one of the more cumbersome rituals. By the time the agreement was finalized, both sides seemed genuinely invested in making it work. It is imperfect, Keltis said, studying the document. All the best things are, Halliday replied with a grin. Throne gave a satisfied nod. We have done well, Zorthil. Keltis inclined his head in acknowledgement. Indeed, Talanex. As the delegations prepared to leave, Halliday felt a rare sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just the peace agreement, though that was certainly a victory. It was the knowledge that he'd helped two ancient enemies find common ground, not through threats or bribes, but through something as simple and as powerful as shared laughter. As Keltis and Throne exchanged formal nods of respect, Halliday knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But for the first time in centuries, the Zorthil and Talanex weren't standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. They were standing together, however tentatively, at the beginning of something new. And that, Halliday thought, was a win. As the doors closed behind the two delegations, a council representative approached Halliday, shaking their head in disbelief. "I don't know how you did it," the representative said. "I thought this conflict was unsolvable." Halliday grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Easy," he said. "All it took was a little chaos, and a lot of snacks." The representative gave him a baffled look. "You're an unusual diplomat, Mr. Halliday." Halliday shrugged. "Unusual is what humans do best." With that, he grabbed a slice of leftover pizza and made his way toward the exit, whistling a jaunty tune as he went. The galaxy was still a mess, and there was plenty of work to do. But for now, he'd earned a moment to enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. As he took a bite of pizza, he allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. "Sometimes," he murmured to himself, "all it takes to change the galaxy is knowing when to roll the dice."